Okay, well, in true CCL fashion, we will get started right at 5 o'clock. I'm going to hit unmute, or sorry, mute all, and then if you guys are on the computer, you can hit the unmute button, and if you're on the phone, I believe it is *6 to unmute yourself. So here we go. And then I will give Tony a moment to unmute himself and come back to us. And in the meantime, I will say thank you everyone for being on this call. It's really great to be on the line with all of you and have your interest in this project. Today we're going to be hearing from Tony Serna, who's on CCL staff. He is the CCL state level policy. Tony is the CCL state level policy coordinator. And so we have created an organization just a little while ago called CalFACT, and you can probably see the name and the logo up on the screen if you're on your computer. If you're on the phone, it shows that CalFACT stands for Californians for a Carbon Tax. So that's the little acronym. So we had great news a few weeks ago that there's a new bill in the California Senate. It's SB775. And basically, it's a bill that modifies California's cap and trade system to look more similar to carbon fee and dividend than it has in the past. So with that, if we have Tony, he will take it away. And I'll just say that we'll hold questions till the end because there's a lot of material. If you do have maybe a quick clarification, we could do that. But in general, please save your questions.
Please leave your name and a message, and I'll get back to you shortly.
Uh-oh.
Okay. Okay, I just muted them. Yeah, so this is Tony Serna, and as many of you know, I'm one of the IT directors for Citizens Climate Lobby, but today I'm going to be speaking on behalf of Californians for a Carbon Tax. And if you do have clarifying questions throughout, you can put those in the chat window, and we might be able to pick up some of those as things go along, but mostly we're going to save them for the end. And I'm going to make the slides available afterwards, and there will also be a recording of this presentation, so you can rest assured that you'll be able to get access to this material afterwards. So without further ado, I'm going to move in and talk about our agenda. So we're just going to do some background on CalFACT, background on cap and trade, and on environmental justice concerns, details of some of the bills that are in California's legislature right now, and then look at some of CCL's principles for state-level carbon pricing, and then how you might get involved as an individual or as a chapter. So one thing I will note, since we are doing slides, but some people are just on phone, there might be some things that I read a little bit more than I would otherwise, and vice versa, some things you might not be able to see, and I apologize for both of those. So Californians for a Carbon Tax started in the last couple of months, and we're a grassroots organization promoting equitable, efficient, and effective carbon pricing in California. The founders and steering committee of CalFACT are all Citizens Climate Lobby volunteers, and they include Jan Dietrich, Marty Roach, Mary Selkirk, Robin Cooper, myself, Tony Serna, and Valerie Bain from around the state. And we've been working on the question of carbon pricing in California, mostly with the Air Resources Board and their scoping plan as they look to extend their cap and trade system beyond 2020. But now we've gotten involved at the legislative level as things are shifting over to that arena. So first I want to provide some background on California's cap and trade program. It was initially approved in 2006 by the Global Warming Solutions Act. People commonly call it AB 32. AB 32 approved a whole suite of things to reduce climate emissions, but that included cap and trade. In 2010, they finished the first version of an approved cap and trade, and the first round of compliance period was 2013. And at first it only applied to large emitters, so utilities, industrial plants, refineries, cement factories, things like that. But in 2015, it also included transportation fuels. So whenever motor fuel is sold in California, the seller has to purchase an allowance based on the emissions that that motor fuel is going to produce. So now cap and trade covers 85% of California's greenhouse gas emissions. The current cap and trade system has a steadily declining cap on emissions. Each year, ARB sets the emission limit and how many allowances it will sell. Those allowances are auctioned to the highest bidder, except that 50% of allowances are allocated for free to protect energy-intensive businesses. So the idea is that we want to prevent energy-intensive, large-emitting businesses from just relocating out of state, or people just will purchase all of their cement or all of their electricity from some other location, and that will not actually reduce any emissions. So that the method that cap and trade often uses to address that is the offering of free allowances. Also, California's system includes carbon offsets, where rather than reducing emissions directly, an emitter can pay someone else to reduce emissions for them. Usually it has to be in some program that's not covered by the cap and trade system, and it can be either in California or out of state. And each year, up to 8% of compliance can come from carbon offsets. Allowances can be banked from year to year, so they can be saved and traded in the future. Currently, the cap and trade system has a floor price of $13.56, and that amount rises at 5% each year. It also has a soft cap on what that price can rise to in the market. They call that the allowance price containment reserve, and so there's additional allowances that can be sold if the price reaches that price, and that is currently set at about $60 above the floor price. All the revenue from cap and trade goes into something called the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which has to go to programs that reduce emissions, but it is allocated in the budget process each year by the legislature and the governor. Emission limits originally started at the target was that in 2020 we need to return to 1990 levels. Emissions had gone up above 1990 levels, and so the cap was set to return there in 2020. And then in 2016, SB775 was passed, and that strengthened those limits to 40% below 1990 levels by 2030 and 80% below by 2050. And I'll show you a little graph on that in a second, so if you want to visualize that. Also in 2016, a bill was passed called AB 197, which requires that the Air Resources Board, or ARB, that they prioritize direct emission reductions. And that was a big win for the environmental justice community to prioritize reducing the emissions directly in the areas that are, promote creating harmful emissions in those communities. It's a little bit of a vague statement to the ARB, so it's not exactly clear how that will manifest, but that was a directive from the legislature. At this point, there's a lot of uncertainty about whether cap and trade can continue beyond 2020 without being reauthorized by the legislature. Most of the legal scholars that we talked to say that it does need to get reauthorized. There's some thought that it could continue, but it's a little bit ambiguous. The Air Resources Board thinks that it can be continued, but that's obviously in their best interest to say that, so that they can, at least give that a try, and it might bring a lawsuit that there's a chance that they would win, but it seems like a small chance. The governor would love this program to be extended. He wants to leave a climate legacy in California, and he's been pushing to get cap and trade extended this legislative session, and ideally as part of the budget process, which needs to be completed by June 15th. So most of the work on this is going to be happening in the next 4 to 6 weeks. Cap and trade extension requires a 2/3 majority due to Prop 26, which was a ballot initiative in 2010 that requires that all taxes or fees in California must be approved by a 2/3 majority of the legislature or by a ballot measure. And right now, the Democrats have a 2/3 majority in both the Senate and the Assembly, but there's not at all a guarantee that all of those people would vote for this. There's a lot of moderate Democrats who have some concerns about cap and trade, so it will take a lot of work to get those votes. There are some concerns and issues with the current cap and trade program. One is that currently the cap is above the actual emissions level in California, so it's really not doing much work. The emissions reductions that we have seen have come from the recession in 2008. We saw a big drop in emissions then, just as the economy contracted. There's been a lot of innovation, prices of renewables coming down, et cetera. And then there's also a lot of complementary programs in AB 32 and in the state to reduce emissions. So we have a renewable portfolio standard that requires utilities to use renewable energy. We have a low carbon fuel standard which promotes use of lower carbon motor fuels. There's a whole host of emissions reductions regulations in our state. And one of the tricky things about the current cap and trade system is that those complementary programs are not in addition to cap and trade. Every time there's a certain cap that's set, and when those other programs are effective, they reduce the emissions. Well, what that ends up doing is it makes it easier for other emitters to, it keeps the price down. It means that emissions allowances are cheap. So it actually makes it easier for those emitters to keep emitting. So every time we tell utilities that they have to install renewable energy, we're essentially telling refineries and cement plants that they're going to be able to keep emitting for longer. And so that's one of the things that's different between a carbon tax and a cap and trade system. So I wanted to highlight that sort of odd, perverse effect from the cap and trade system. Another concern people often raise is that the offsets that are offered may not be real reductions. There are standards that are pretty good, but anytime when you're paying someone to reduce their emissions by planting trees or installing a biogas facility, et cetera, it's hard to know whether those emissions are truly what's called additional. Like if they were they going to happen in the first place or not, or are they only happening because you're paying for that emission? So they definitely complicate, and reduce the integrity of the emissions reductions. And then there's this problem that people call resource shifting, where a lot of California's electricity comes from out of state, and it used to be that was a mix of coal power, natural gas, and renewables. Now people just sell the renewables to California, and they still sell the coal and natural gas to other places. And so it looks like California's emissions are going down, but the worldwide emissions are not actually going down. And then, as I mentioned, the environmental justice communities are really concerned about the harmful emissions in their communities, and they're not seeing the reductions to those emissions as fast as they were promised. So here's that graph on what the targets are for emissions reduction. So 40% below 1990 levels by 2030, 80% below by 2050. These are very aggressive targets. They're some of the best targets in the world right now, and they're definitely what's needed. There's what's called for by the IPCC in terms of meeting the 2-degree level that's been agreed to in Paris. So these are good targets, but they're not going to be easy to meet. There's definitely going to be some work involved, and so we definitely need some good policies in place to reach those targets. I want to talk a little bit more about environmental justice. CalFACT has specifically been reaching out to environmental justice groups and communities to try and support them in their efforts to reform cap and trade, and in their efforts to get the greenhouse gas reductions that they want, as well as reducing the harmful pollutants. Just to give some background, if you don't know environmental justice, the EPA defines it as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So rather than just just the legislators or just the powerful people in our culture making the decisions about environmental issues, it's involving everyone in that process. And so the EJ groups represent local residents or those who work as advocates with them, addressing issues of health and other impacts from local polluters. And when AB 32 was created, it included an Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, which consults with the California Air Resources Board. And CalFACT has been working closely with some of the members of the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee. So some of the EJ concerns with cap and trade is that the promises of reduced pollution have not come to pass. And some of their recommendations to the Air Resources Board is that they want to end the carbon offsets, they want to end free allowances, they want to end the trading of allowances, and they want to prioritize direct emission reductions. They also want to have systems to directly cap harmful emissions. And they've been coming out pretty clearly in terms of pricing carbon more directly than the market-based cap and trade system. So they have a declaration that was produced by the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, and I'll just read it really quickly for those who are on the phone. It says, the California Environmental Justice Movement declares that it supports a carbon tax used in combination with direct emission reductions as a policy to replace the revenue generating component of cap and trade and to benefit environmental justice communities, support clean energy development, fund a just workforce transition to clean energy, invest in communities' capacity and infrastructure to adapt to climate change, and return a substantial portion to the public so that Californians, especially low-income residents, receive financial support during the transition to a clean energy economy. So some of the key pieces in there for CCL and CalFACT is that they're definitely supporting a carbon tax, and they're specifically endorsing a dividend. That's not 100% dividend, but there's definitely support for a dividend in that language. So that brings us to Senate Bill 775, which was introduced 1 week ago into the California Senate. It's a reform of cap and trade. And sort of the one sentence summary that I've come up with is that SB 775 provides a much needed overhaul of California's cap and trade system to make it more effective at reaching our climate goals and more equitable for California residents and businesses. So that's, if someone asks you and you're like, oh, how do I summarize what's going on? That's the statement that I might use, or feel free to adapt it to your purposes. The bill was introduced by Senator Bob Wachowski and had the support of the Senate leader, Kevin De Leon. So here's some talking points that we've come up with on SB 775. Why would you want to support this? 1, polluters will pay a predictable and steadily rising price on carbon emissions. 2, all California residents will receive a quarterly dividend check that will protect them from price increases. SB 775 provides investment to speed the transition to a clean energy future. It includes a border adjustment that will protect jobs in California by discouraging businesses from relocating to where they can emit more CO2 and motivate other countries to adopt similar carbon pricing policies. And the bill provides more price certainty that will help large and small businesses make plans and decisions that will support their success during the clean energy transition. And this bill addresses some of the environmental justice concerns by requiring all polluters to pay and motivating real emissions reductions in the hardest hit communities. So we're going to go through those different pieces to flesh out some of the details. But that's sort of like talking points and overview of some of the aspects of SB 775. So let's talk about the pricing system. So SB 775 is a hybrid between cap and trade. It's got a steadily rising carbon price that's set by there still is a cap that on allowances each year, and they're auctioned between a floor and a ceiling price. So there's not one specific price the way there would be in a carbon tax, but there's sort of a range of prices. And so the floor price, provides the floor and the ceiling price provide predictability while also offering some flexibility to allow the prices to vary as our economy grows and changes. And it protects businesses and consumers from sudden and unpredictable spikes. Under the current program, there's some amount of capping of the price, but it could still spike beyond that price, and it's sort of unpredictable when or how that will happen. And it can help businesses and consumers plan for investments in emission reductions. By having that predictability, it really helps with that process. It also provides for better revenue predictability. Right now, cap and trade is suffering from auctions that aren't actually selling all their emissions allowances, And so the money that was expected to go to programs to reduce emissions is just not being available. So the way the pricing works is that there's a certain number of allowances that would be auctioned. The floor price would start at $20 in 2021, increasing by $5 a year starting in 2023 plus inflation. So that's rising much faster than the current floor price that's rising at 5% per year. The ceiling price would start at $30 in 2021 and increase by $10 a year plus inflation. So by 2030, we would see prices at least $120 for the ceiling price. Now, unlike the current system, the ceiling price would provide a hard cap on price, but would be a soft cap on emissions. So if prices rose to that level, then the ARB would auction off or would sell an unlimited amount of allowances at the ceiling price. So this is a concern that some people have, that it would reduce the sort of certainty that people expect out of the cap, but we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So let's go on to the dividend and how that will affect things, how that will be implemented. So there's a California Climate Dividend Fund. They haven't specified the percent of the revenue that would go to that yet. When they talk to the press, they're talking about numbers like 90% of revenue, but it's in the bill, there's a conspicuous blank spot that needs to be filled in. It will support and protect the many who would otherwise be challenged by the rising prices. As we know in CCL, low-income households will benefit the most from their climate dividend checks, and it's going to provide ongoing support from voters, which is critical as the price rises. And our studies from CCL show that dividends can boost the economy and create jobs. We assume the same would happen in California. The system in SB775 is simpler than CCL's in that the dividend would go equally to all California residents, adults and children, and would go to including undocumented residents, the homeless, the unbanked. Basically everyone would get a dividend. The bill also provides for 2 reinvestment funds. It's unclear exactly how much money is going to go to those, but whatever's not going to the dividend would go to the 2 funds. And there's one called the California Climate Infrastructure Fund, and one that's the California Climate and Clean Energy Research Fund. So these would function similarly to the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund in that they would, have some limits on what the money could go towards, but that has not been spelled out yet. So yeah, we don't know the amount. We don't know exactly how they're going to be managed. So there's a lot of unknowns still with the investment funds. The bill has a border adjustment, which is sort of a new thing for a state level policy. Just like CCL's proposal, it puts a matching carbon price on carbon intensive imports and a matching rebate for exports. This would protect the economy and protect jobs in California from businesses relocating to places where they could emit more freely. And it also creates an incentive to other economies to set carbon prices. And it provides a great model for national and other subnational legislation. There are concerns that such a border adjustment may not be upheld. There are some concerns that it would come in conflict with the U.S. Constitution's Commerce Clause, which gives the federal government the power to regulate interstate commerce. But there are the authors of the bill and some important legal scholars think that it will pass muster with the courts based on some existing cases involving California's low carbon fuel standards. And if it were struck down, the bill specifically allows for free allowances that could be issued as a backup. So it wouldn't destroy the entire bill if that part was struck down. So how does this address some of the environmental justice issues? It removes offsets, for one. It removes free allowances. It would motivate reduction at all facilities, since the price paid will be paid by all emitters. So it gets rid of that sort of perverse thing where as some emitters are already reducing, others can continue to reduce, can continue to emit. The higher price should motivate faster reductions. And the dividend provides for broad reach to all Californians. But it does not actually address all of the EJ concerns. So there's some talk of tying this bill to another bill in the Assembly called AB 378, which addresses air quality. There are some environmental justice groups that have already come out to support it. California Environmental Justice Alliance, the Center for Race, Poverty, and the Environment, the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, the Legislative Council for Justice and Accountability. So they've already issued a statement that shows some support for this bill, though they still certainly have some questions and concerns to see how it's going to play out. There are some groups that are opposed. The Environmental Defense Fund has expressed opposition, but they have often been strong defenders of the existing cap and trade program. And then we're also hearing that Food and Water Watch is planning to come out against this, but they in general are against almost any pricing-based mechanism and much more in favor of regulatory mechanisms for reducing emissions. I did want to go over a little bit from AB 378, which is another bill that's in the Assembly right now that also addresses cap and trade. It's specifically concerned about harmful health-related emissions. So it was submitted by Assembly members Garcia, and Holden. It requires the ARB to take into account the social cost of carbon. It requires prioritization of direct emissions reductions. It specifies that no given facility is allowed to increase its greenhouse gas emissions beyond the 2014 to 16 average. It allows the ARB to adopt no trade zones or facility-specific declining emissions limits. And it requires the ARB to adopt pollution emission standards for each industrial facility. And then if a facility is not meeting those standards, it would prohibit them from purchasing allowances, which would basically mean that they couldn't, it basically ties this to the cap and trade program and would say that emitters have to do this thing or they're not allowed to continue operating. So that's AB 378 in a nutshell. There's also AB 151, which is a sort of direct extension of the current cap and trade bill. And that's basically what the ARB is supporting right now is extending the current authority for the existing program. So I want to go into a little bit on what CCL's involvement is with these kinds of state level carbon pricing policies. CCL agreed that it was open to supporting state level policies that provide for greater emissions reductions than current law, that protect low income households, that harmonize well with carbon fee and dividend, and are politically viable for the state. We think that this policy meets all of those criteria, but CCL also specified that CCL doesn't want to be the front-facing organization for any effort in a state and really wants a different organization to take that lead. And so that's why we started CalFACT. We're hoping that CCL volunteers will get involved with CalFACT, but when discussing state policy with legislators, CCL really asks that its volunteers identify as CalFACT or just as citizens, but not specifically identify this as something that CCL is pushing for, to sort of make a little bit of space between our national efforts and the state level effort. So CCL has not yet made an endorsement of SB775 or any California bill. We're still in dialogue about that. We're trying to see how things shake out a little bit before we make a final endorsement, but certainly something that CCL is looking at closely and obviously encouraging Californian volunteers to look at closely. So how might you get involved personally or with your chapter? So personally, one thing you can do is you can sign up at calfact.org and you'll get our very infrequent emails to keep you up to date on what's going on in California with this policy, with these policies. You can read more about Senate Bill 775 on our website. We have a page about it. We also have a page about AB 378, and we'll keep that up to date with news articles and whatever other information comes up as things progress. You can contact your legislators, so you can find your reps online. If you're in California, it's at findyourrep.legislature.california.gov. And we've actually created a little call-in script. If you want, you can go to calfact.org and go to Take Action SB775, and you can find a suggested script for how you can, what you could use to contact your state legislators. And I do want to specify that this is your state legislators, not your federal legislators. So, not the person who represents you in Washington, D.C., but the person who represents you in Sacramento. So every one of us has a state assembly member and a state senator. Not surprisingly, you could write letters to the editor or op-eds, and you can also set up meetings with your state senators and assembly members. Remember to identify yourself as CalFACT or just as a concerned citizen. And you can also reach out to other climate groups and share info with them, and you can reach out to environmental justice groups, find out what they think, build a relationship with them. You know, this is a great opportunity to start discussing carbon pricing with people, you know, and that will help build those relationships for you as you do your CCL work as well. And of course, just like we do with CCL and with endorsers, you can reach out to business and community leaders, and you could ask them to officially support the bill and or come and lobby with you. And how can your chapter get involved? You could create a team to work on California state carbon pricing. You could, your chapter can decide to endorse one or more of these bills. And that's something that can happen independently of CCL National's endorsement. Each chapter has the ability to endorse, you know, you can endorse your climate march and you can endorse a specific local policy. Well, you know, a chapter also has the authority, using whatever process you use, to endorse state level policies if you think that will help with your work, and especially help with your work as we continue to focus on the federal level in CCL. You can also use this as an opportunity to discuss carbon pricing with business leaders and, you know, community leaders. And that's it. We're on to Q&A. So Tasha, maybe you can pull some of those questions out of the chat.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Tony. That was wonderful. Lots of great information in there. Yeah, so from the chat, we had a couple people early on asking about border adjustments and what that would actually look like, especially at a state level as opposed to national borders.
Sure. So basically, the details of that is left up to the Air Resources Board. So they would have to determine which products they think are worthy of having a border adjustment. So it wouldn't necessarily apply to every single import or export, but it would apply to energy intensive products. And then they would try and estimate what the equivalent carbon price should be on those imports. And they've already done a lot of this work for the existing cap and trade, because their policy on free allowances basically looks at the same kinds of factors. Where are we at risk for businesses leaving the state to avoid the emissions charges? So that would leave up the details to the ARB. The goal would be to have it match pretty closely to whatever the similar carbon fees would be placed on you know, are being placed on industry that's within the state of California.
Great. Okay. Well, let's take another question from people on the phone or on the computer before we go back to the chat for another question. So go ahead, if you have a question, unmute yourself, and we'll see how that goes. So Tony, if they're on the phone, it's *6 to unmute. Is that correct?
Yes, *6, or if you're online, there's a mute button usually in the lower left.
Can I ask a question? This is Dan Brotman.
Go ahead,
Hi, Dan.
Dan.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Hi. Yeah. Do you know why they decided not to allow, I don't know what you call it, banking or carryover from year to year?
Yeah. So if you allowed banking, if you allowed people to carry over emissions, then that would encourage people to buy them in 1 year and save them for multiple years. And so rather than paying the price in that given year, they'd be paying the price previous years, and that can create some speculation and just a bunch of weird effects on the market. So that's another way that this turns it more into a carbon tax-like vehicle rather than a trading scheme. And the banking, you know, has been a problem, you know, because the cap has been above the emissions level. It means that right now people can buy emissions allowances and then bank them. And so if that happened again in the future, there would be really no value in that because you couldn't save those allowances for the future. So it somewhat protects against that scenario where the cap is higher than the current emission levels.
So we had a similar question in the chat, which you kind of just covered, but maybe even explain this as well. Can you define banked and unbanked?
Oh, so that's related to the dividend. And so a lot of people, many people have a bank account, but if you don't have a bank account, how do you get your dividend check? So it basically directs there's going to be a new board that would govern the dividend, and it says that they would need to look at how to get money to all the vulnerable populations, the undocumented, homeless populations, people who are underbanked or unbanked, in a way that really is effective for them. And that if they are unable to find a way to directly get the money to them, then they could give it to a nonprofit that serves those populations. So like if you can't get directly to the homeless people, you could give it to a nonprofit that serves homeless people.
Nice.
This is Rob in Pasadena. I got a question.
Yeah, please.
Tony, so what's the linkage between the cap and the ceiling price? How is that determined?
So
and how does the cap come down?
So the cap comes down. If we go back and if we looked at all the slides, and let me go back to that graph here. So the cap is going to come down at a steady rate between 2020 and 2030. So if it's got to drop by 40% over 10 years, then it's got to drop at 4% a year, more or less, and then a slightly lower rate between 2030 and 2050. So that's where the cap is set. And basically you can imagine then, so that sets a certain number of allowances. And if, and let's just for a round number, we'll say, let's sell 100 allowances. Well, if people only want to buy 90 allowances, then they're going to sell at the floor price. If people want to buy 110 allowances, then the price is going to go up. And it's like, if it goes up a little higher and people say like, yeah, never mind, I don't want to buy some allowances because I can just do this thing at my power plant to reduce emissions. It's actually cheaper to install solar panels or cheaper to install a new boiler. They're going to do that instead. So that could keep the price somewhere between the floor and the ceiling. But if people really want to buy those emissions credits, then that's going to keep driving, or emissions allowance, that's going to drive the price up potentially as high as the ceiling. And so if you get to the ceiling price and people say, the ceiling price, let's say, is $100 in that year, and people say, wow, I still can't reduce emissions even at $100. I would rather buy this allowance than do something else to reduce emissions. Then they can continue to buy that allowance at that price, and that an unlimited number would be reached. So at that point, and the case where that might happen is if the economy is really booming in California, but the more likely scenario is that it would, stay at that somewhere between the floor and the ceiling, and that this would effectively, raise the price each year.
Yeah, but it's just a guess at what the price is still then attached to that ceiling. I mean, I get the 4% decrease per year, but there's no mapping between that and a specific class. So if in other words, if all the allowances were sold, then it would be up at the ceiling price.
Mm-hmm.
But does that automatically mean 4% decrease?
No. So under the current system, at that point, the price would continue to rise. Under the new system, under SB775, the price would stay at that level, and they would sell additional allowances, and so it could allow emissions to go beyond the cap. So it does not provide the same level of direct capping of the emissions, but one of the concerns about the existing program is that you have this cap, but because it doesn't have sufficient price containment, when you hit that, the price could skyrocket much higher, and at that point the legislature could come in and undo the program with a 50% vote, which, if the price suddenly jumped from $20, to $200, they would probably do that, and then so you've now lost your emission certainty, and things would go beyond the cap anyways. So the goal here is to provide predictability while you're sacrificing a little bit of that, at least the sense of emission certainty. You're trying to prevent the undoing of the program by a price spike.
Okay, thanks.
Do we have any more questions from people online or on the phone?
I did try to find CalFACT.org. Can you spell that out?
Yeah, it's Californians for a Carbon Tax. So it's CalFACT.org. So F as in Frank, I think was the letter you missed there.
Yes, CalFACT, FACT.org. All right, thanks.
No problem.
This is Nick Despota in Alameda. Can you explain the opposition or the hesitation that moderate Democrats have expressed against this and their hesitation to support it?
I mean, so moderate Democrats in California are often considered to align more with business interests, and so in general have been less supportive of climate change initiatives. But they may end up, with some persuasion, see that this could actually be a better bill for businesses because of the predictability. And so while it does raise the prices on emissions, which is good for the climate, and you could see that as potentially bad for businesses, it may not. It gives them more predictability, so it lowers the range of what those prices will be. And so there is some hope that we can get those moderate Democrats and even some Republicans on board with that program. But I'd say, so it's not clear that the moderate Democrats, it's not that they support the existing cap and trade program more than this program, it's that they, in general, are a little bit resistant to both of those. And the concern right now is that California just passed a gas tax, and that which also required a 2/3 majority, which they did get, but it was a heavy lift, and there had to be a lot of persuasion to get everyone to vote on that. And so there's some concern that opponents will just call this another gas tax, and that will make some legislators afraid to vote for it, despite the dividend that offsets that. It's still about politics and public perception more than sometimes than the reality of things.
This is related to that. Why do you think ARB is not supporting it, but rather is going for basically an extension of the current cap and trade program, which I understand is AB 151?
I don't know all the details there, but I would say that in general, they've invested a lot of time and energy into developing that program. It's nuanced and complex, and they understand it really well. They think it's a good program, and so from their perspective, why would you change it when it's currently working? And so they know it. Their stakeholders know it. Business interests that they work with know it. So I'd say that's the main thing, is that it's the known entity.
This is Abigail. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, so one of the things I'm struck by is that how difficult this is going to be to explain and sell to a general public, and how easy it will be to distort and play make all sorts of arguments going about all the complexity of it. So it seems like if there isn't a really straightforward sales for this and a complete weight of the unified environmental community behind it, there'll be a crack in the wall, and you won't get that 2/3 that you need. So I guess what's the plan? There can't to really make this a marketable solution. It sounds like a good solution. It sounds like it solves a lot of problems, but you can't. But the complexities of what you're talking about here are not going to work.
I agree that simplicity is certainly, we would love more simplicity here. It's in a lot of ways simpler than the current system, but the way they did it in AB 32, the legislature, all they approved was the emissions targets and left the rest of it to the ARB to determine, whereas this starts to get into the details. So I do think that it could be tricky to get it approved. I think that we will have to work on messaging and how to sell this simply to people. I think in some ways it would be much easier if it were just a straight ahead carbon tax and dividend. But in the politics in California, this hybrid option offers a chance for those who are supportive of cap and trade to see this as a continuation of cap and trade, and so they can get a win. Whereas people who are supportive of carbon taxes can see this as, a big reform, so they can get a win. So there is some hope that it can push all the right buttons to get the right people on board, but I agree with everything that you said, that it's not going to be easy.
And what do you think is, you listed things for people to do and contact, but in reality, it seems like there has to be a list of the people in Sacramento who are the linchpins or the keystone players in this that people need to target.
Yes, we're working on getting that list together. I think that we'll be able to find, figure out who the key players are. There's the moderate Dems. There's a handful of Republicans who have expressed some interest in working on climate issues in California. And then there's probably, the trick is you also have to get all the environmental justice people on board as well. So you need to, retain the far left while also, building in the middle. So I think there's some potential, but and we'll certainly be working to try and give more details on who the key players are.
Hi, this is Russ.
Along those lines, a quick question from the chat. Has Brown said anything about the bill?
I have not heard of any comment from Jerry Brown on it yet.
This is Russ in Culver City. Could you say a little bit about what the legal arguments are that get you around the Commerce Clause problem?
That's somewhat beyond my skill level, but my sense is that if you look at some of the cases related to the low carbon fuel standards, we've already had cases that supported California charging a carbon adjustment based on where the fuel was coming from in the country. So legal scholars think that is a pathway to getting approval for it. It's just sort of extending that same procedure more broadly. So, but I can't get into more detail than that because I'm just not a lawyer and don't know.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
This is Bob from Green Bay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, Bob, go ahead.
So my question about cap and trade, both the new version and the old, is who has to buy these?
So the allowances are sold to big emitters. So that includes, power plants, refineries, cement plants, big industrial facilities. And then also, any of the utilities have to pay them for, all the electricity that's sold in California and all the natural gas that's sold to, commercial and residential, and then all motor fuels. So it's not, I'm not exactly sure where in the supply chain the motor fuel thing gets charged, but it does cover all of those different areas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's my question, is the motor fuels versus the refineries, because yeah.
So the refineries pay directly for the emissions that they're directly emitting as they produce the fuel. Right. And then someone, maybe it's the refineries or somewhere else in the chain, pays for the emissions for the fuel that is then sold. So those are two different things. There's the emissions at the plant, and then there's the emissions of the gasoline that's going to get burned.
Product, yeah.
Both of them have to have allowances, but they are a little bit separate.
Right, and on the same one, CARB decides how many allowances to put out each year, right? Hopefully to match the degree of improvement that we require. Correct. Right. And after the auctions, is there trading sometimes?
Right now there's definitely trading. I mean, in the future thing, there can be trading in the sense of like, if you thought you were going to use 100 allowances and you only ended up needing 90, you can sell the other 10 to someone else.
Yeah. Okay. So. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey,
Great.
Tony, David from Marin. I was concerned before the call started about the confusion of messages that those of us from California in particular are going to be taking to Washington in a month. But I was glad to hear you say that this proposal is somewhat less perfect than the CCL proposal. And so would you say that it's valid for us to say to anybody who asks that we from California are still backing a revenue neutral carbon fee and dividend for the country with a border adjustment at the international border, by the way, not interstate border. Mm-hmm. And that we can do so with a clear conscience and still back adjustments to the California setting, because this is real. We have this program in place already in California, so we're adjusting existing facts here. Is that a fair way to summarize?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it as no one would ever propose this system if you weren't already in a state that had a cap and trade system in place. Like you would just go straight to carbon fee and dividend.
Right.
So it's the way to reform something that you already have, and so I would never propose this at a national level.
Tony, Peter Joseph here.
Go, Peter.
Do you perceive this effort as a stepping stone or a way station to a revenue neutral carbon fee and dividend, either in California or the U.S.? It seems to me what you're describing a very politically charged situation, and the feeling is this bill is about as good as we can get right now under the circumstances. Is that correct?
I think it's probably as good as we could get in California, given the political dynamics here. And I think it is a stepping stone. I mean, if nothing else, it puts out, if this gets passed and California starts, doing a dividend, like that gets the concept of a dividend, implemented and discussed and, becomes part of the lexicon of carbon pricing systems in a real way that right now it's more theoretical. I think that California has a big influence on other countries. Obviously, this affects Canada, as people have noted. It also will affect some of the other countries in the Americas, because California has been trying to link with Mexico. So I do think that this changes the dynamics. It sets a very aggressive target on prices. So, it takes Canada's level of $50 a ton and ups that level. And so I do think it's a stepping stone, and that if it were to be were to be approved, that would be a very, I think that would help us in CCL, and even just the process of it being discussed, has a pretty good chance of helping CCL as we build relationships and build political will and get these concepts out into the idea marketplace.
I agree with that, but I would also be concerned that it sends the signal to other countries that cap and trade is what we're really doing with all these modifications. But I don't think we want the rest of the world sticking with cap and trade. It hasn't worked, and it won't work in weak countries with weak institutions and corruption. And then we're really behind the eight ball. So I'd like California to be sending the signal, yeah, we really do recommend a carbon tax. This is the best we could do right now, but we're heading in that direction, or something like that to clean up the messaging.
Right. Well, I don't get to control what Jerry Brown's going to say about it if it ever passes. But I think I agree with you that would be good. I agree that carbon taxes are much easier to implement in any jurisdiction, and that's where we should be headed. But, I think right now California is already pushing cap and trade on a world basis. And so, your options right now, it's unlikely that we have the option for a carbon tax in California, at least not through a legislative process. Like, it would probably have to go to a ballot initiative. And, that would also be a big fight and, a big unknown. So, you can always play absolutes and decide that you think that the best possible option is to let cap and trade go, and that will force the hand to towards a carbon tax, but you never really know. So.
Yeah, it sounds like you're going to endorse it, but I think as a organization that, by its very name, advocates a carbon tax, I think you're going to endorse it, but I think you might want to add an asterisk saying, we're endorsing this, but the real solution is a carbon tax. We hope that this will get us halfway there. Something like that. That'll keep your integrity while supporting the bill.
Yeah.
Sure.
Good point, Peter.
Okay, other questions, Tasha? We don't have too much time left.
We do have quite a bit going on in the chat. Kathy from Canada, if she's still on the line, did you want to just go ahead and ask one of your questions? Okay, let's go back to whoever was just trying to ask a question.
Hi there, this is Whitney. I'm in San Francisco. Do we know when this is due up for a vote or a next action?
So this was scheduled to go to a committee hearing on Wednesday, but that's been delayed. They wanted some time in that committee to discuss some of these underlying questions of, does cap and get some clarity on, does cap and trade need to be extended, and if so, and if not, and what does that happen? So that's what they're going to be talking about in the Senate Environmental Quality Committee this Wednesday in Sacramento. So we expect it to come to that committee soon. And we don't know exactly the dates on that or on a vote. The governor has indicated that he wants this to be passed as part of the budget, which is supposed to be June 15th. There's also concern because there's a legislator in the assembly who is running for a federal office, and if they win, then there would no longer be the 2/3 majority in the assembly among Democrats, and so there's a desire to get this done before they leave that process. And so there's a big push on it for June 15th or end of June. I've heard. My understanding is that all the legislation in California has to get done by the end of September 15th. So those are the sort of timeframes that we're talking about here if it's going to get done this year.
Great, thank you.
This is Sharon.
Go ahead, Sharon.
Yeah, I'm a little concerned that this is putting lipstick on a pig, and if we're doing that, I'm afraid that it undermines our focus on getting a national carbon fee and dividend kind of legislation passed. Would there be a way that this could negatively impact that process?
Yeah, I want to be clear that you should not at all reduce your focus on a national carbon fee and dividend. I think that you should work on this if you feel like you have surplus energy in yourself or in your group. You should work on this if you think it will actually synergize with your work towards a federal process. And if you don't think it will help you build those relationships and build support for a federal carbon fee and dividend, then it's fine to choose not to work on it. Are there scenarios where this is bad for that effort? Sure, there's potential risks involved at all times in terms of if people come out against the dividend, then that could tarnish it, or if it's really successful, then people could say it's a California solution and it's supported by Democrats and therefore Republicans won't touch it. I mean, there's any number of political possibilities, but for the most part, it's got the support. I've been in dialogue with Mark Reynolds and Danny Richter and, the right people at CCL, and they are supportive of this work in both in California and in other states where they're working on carbon pricing. So, but if in your judgment it doesn't meet that requirement, then that's really up to you.
Yeah, well put. That's so true. Okay, well, it looks like it's just about time, so we can go ahead and wrap the call up. I don't know if Tony has a few final words for us.
No, the slides I'm gonna post them online at the CalFACT website. I've got a page already set up, but it doesn't have anything there yet at calfact.org/May 8 for today's date. Oops. And the recording will also be available. And if you have questions, you can email calfact@calfact.org. And if you are interested in attending the hearing on Wednesday in Sacramento, we can provide information on that. And if there are other questions, I'm definitely willing to spend a few more minutes answering those past the end of 6 o'clock.
Can I interrupt here, Tony? You just said the hearing on Wednesday that was canceled.
It was not canceled. They changed the topic from specifically discussing this bill to discussing some of the background on cap and trade.
Oh, so the hearing is still going forward, but not a specific on SB775.
That's correct.
I see. Thank you.
So I'm going to wrap it up, but I'm willing to stick around for another few minutes to answer more questions. But everyone should feel free to leave, and we'll stop the recording now. And thank you very much.
And I'll just go ahead and unmute everyone to say goodbye.
All right.